April 15, 1961. Camp Tracks, Guatemala. Brigade 2506 Commander José Pepe San Roman stood before a wall map of Cuba's southern coast, his finger tracing the invasion route one final time. Around him, Cuban exile officers leaned forward, their faces showing a mixture of anticipation and concern. They had trained for this moment for 9 months, transforming from merchants, lawyers, and students into an invasion force. "The president has changed the landing site again," San Roman announced, pointing to a new location, Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. "He promises complete air support. American jets will destroy Castro's air force before we land." Captain Ernesto Oliva, second in command, studied the new objective with growing unease. The bay was surrounded by swamps, accessible only by 3 narrow causeways. Any military professional could see it was a natural killing ground, but the CIA men who planned the operation dismissed such concerns with confident assurances. Castro's militia would crumble. The Cuban people would rise in support. American air power would ensure success. What San Roman and his 1,400 men didn't know was that every assumption underlying their mission was fatally flawed. The promised air support would never materialize. The expected uprising would never occur. The CIA's intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Within 72 hours, Brigade 2506 would cease to exist as a fighting force. Crushed on the beaches they were promised they would liberate. The Bay of Pigs wouldn't just be a military defeat. It would become a case study in how optimism, political pressure, and bureaucratic momentum could transform a questionable plan into an inevitable disaster. The genesis of failure. The operation that would become the Bay of Pigs invasion began not in Kennedy's administration, but in Eisenhower's final year. On March 17, 1960, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to organize Cuban exiles into a paramilitary force capable of overthrowing Fidel Castro. The directive was clear: develop a capability to support covert action against the Castro regime. Richard Bissell, the CIA's deputy director for plans, took personal charge of the operation. Bissell was the agency's golden boy, the architect of the U-2 spy plane program. His previous successes in Guatemala in 1954, where a small CIA-backed force had toppled the Arbenz government, provided the operational template. The formula seemed simple: train exiles, provide air support, trigger an uprising, install a friendly government. The Guatemala model's apparent success had embedded dangerous assumptions into CIA thinking. The Arbenz coup had succeeded with minimal force because the Guatemalan army chose not to fight. CIA planners assumed Cuban forces would similarly collapse. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. Initial planning called for guerrilla infiltration. Small teams dispersed into Cuba's mountains to build insurgent networks. But Bissell grew increasingly ambitious. By fall 1960, the concept had evolved into a full-scale amphibious invasion requiring naval support, air superiority, and brigade-strength conventional forces. The recruitment camps in Guatemala trained approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles. These weren't professional soldiers. Most had fled Cuba after Castro's revolution, motivated by lost property, political opposition, or fear of communism. Some were former Batista supporters. Others were disillusioned Castro supporters who had believed in reform but rejected communism. The brigade included doctors, engineers, teachers, businessmen. Their ages ranged from teenagers to men in their 50s. What united them was belief that they were fighting to liberate their homeland, and confidence that American support guaranteed success. Training at Camp Tracks and Happy Valley in Guatemala was intensive but flawed. The men learned basic infantry tactics, weapons handling, and small unit operations. They practiced amphibious landings at a beach that bore no resemblance to their actual target. Most critically, they were never trained for the scenario they would actually face: sustained combat without American air support against a prepared enemy with armor and artillery. The political constraints. When John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency on January 20, 1961, he inherited the Cuba operation as a fully developed plan awaiting only presidential approval. Kennedy, who had campaigned on being tough on communism and closing the missile gap with the Soviets, felt political pressure to act decisively on Cuba. The CIA briefed Kennedy on the operation in late January. Bissell and CIA Director Allen Dulles presented the plan with characteristic confidence. Castro's forces were estimated at 25,000 poorly trained militia. His air force consisted of obsolete aircraft. The Cuban people, groaning under communist oppression, would welcome liberation. The invasion would trigger a popular uprising that would sweep Castro from power. Kennedy expressed skepticism, but lacked the expertise to challenge CIA assessments effectively. He had been president for less than 2 weeks. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, when asked for their evaluation, provided ambiguous assessments that could be interpreted as endorsement. No one in authority wanted to be responsible for calling off an operation that had consumed $46 million and 9 months of preparation. Kennedy imposed one critical constraint. The operation must maintain plausible deniability of American involvement. No U.S. forces could participate directly. No American jets could provide air support. The invasion had to appear entirely Cuban in origin and execution. This requirement fundamentally undermined the operation's viability. The original plan had assumed American air power would destroy Castro's small air force before the landing. Now, that destruction would have to be accomplished by brigade pilots flying World War II-era B-26 bombers painted to look like defecting Cuban aircraft. The landing site was changed multiple times to reduce the operation's noise level. The original target, Trinidad, was a populous city with nearby mountains for guerrilla retreat. Kennedy rejected it as too spectacular. The Bay of Pigs was selected specifically because it was remote and uninhabited, reducing international attention. What no one adequately considered was that remoteness also meant isolation. The surrounding Zapata swamp was impassable except by the 3 narrow causeways. If the invasion failed to secure the beachhead quickly, there was no escape route, no mountains for guerrilla operations, no friendly population to blend into. The brigade would be trapped. The intelligence failure. CIA intelligence on Cuba was spectacularly wrong on nearly every significant assessment. The agency estimated Castro's army at 25,000 militia with low morale and minimal training. The actual strength was approximately 200,000, including 20,000 well-trained regular army troops. Castro's forces had been expecting an invasion for months and had prepared defensive plans. The CIA assumed Castro's air force was negligible and could be destroyed in a single strike. In reality, Castro possessed Sea Fury fighters and T-33 jets capable of intercepting the brigade's slow B-26 bombers. His pilots, trained by Soviets, were competent and motivated. Most catastrophically, the CIA predicted the invasion would trigger a popular uprising. This assumption was based on wishful thinking rather than intelligence. Castro had successfully consolidated power through land reform, literacy campaigns, and elimination of political opposition. While many Cubans opposed his regime, few were willing to risk their lives based on a small invasion force landing in a remote swamp. The CIA's assessment that Brigade 2506 could establish and hold a beachhead long enough for a provisional government to be recognized was based on hope rather than military analysis. A realistic assessment would have recognized that 1,400 lightly armed infantry, without armor, artillery, or air superiority, could not defeat a defending force with all those advantages. The first strike, April 15th. The operation began at dawn on April 15th, when 8 B-26 bombers struck Cuban airfields. The pilots, brigade members trained in Nicaragua, attacked with determination but limited effect. They destroyed several Cuban aircraft on the ground, but failed to eliminate Castro's air force. 1 B-26, piloted by a CIA contract pilot, landed in Miami claiming to be a defecting Cuban pilot who had bombed his own airfields. The cover story was immediately exposed. Bullet holes in the aircraft were inconsistent with ground fire. The plane's nose guns had never been fired. Most obviously, photographs showed the aircraft had an American-style nose, not the solid nose of Cuban B-20SXS. The deception's exposure created international embarrassment. United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, who had not been informed the pilot was fake, displayed photographs at the UN as proof of an internal Cuban uprising. When the deception was revealed, Stevenson was humiliated. having unknowingly lied to the world body. More critically, the failed deception convinced Kennedy to cancel the second air strike scheduled for April 16. This strike was supposed to finish destroying Castro's air force. Without it, Castro retained operational aircraft that would prove devastating. The landing, April 17. At 1:15 a.m. on April 17, Brigade 2500 SXS First Elements landed on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs. The plan called for 3 landing sites: Playa Girón, Playa Larga, and the Red Beach. Frogmen went ashore first to mark landing zones, but coral reefs that CIA planners had dismissed as seaweed tore apart several landing craft. The noise of damaged boats alerted local militia. By 2 a.m., Castro's forces knew an invasion was underway. Within hours, Castro had personally taken command at his headquarters in Havana, ordering every available unit to converge on the Bay of Pigs. The brigade's initial landing was chaotic but achieved surprise. By dawn, approximately 1,400 men were ashore with most of their equipment. They secured the 3 beaches and began establishing defensive positions. For a brief period, it appeared the operation might succeed. Then Castro's air force appeared. At approximately 9 a.m., Sea Fury fighters and T-33 jets attacked the supply ships offshore. The Houston, carrying the brigade's 5th Battalion, was hit and sunk. The Rio Escondido, carrying ammunition, fuel, and communications equipment, exploded after direct hits. 2 other supply ships fled into open ocean, taking with them 10 days of ammunition and most of the brigade's medical supplies. Brigade pilots flying B-20SXS from Nicaragua attempted to provide air cover, but they were hopelessly outmatched. The World War II-era bombers were slow and vulnerable. T-33 jets, originally training aircraft but armed with machine guns, shot down several B-20SXS. By the end of April 17th, brigade air support was effectively eliminated. On the ground, the brigade faced increasing pressure. Castro committed a strategic reserve, including T-34 tanks and Stalin tanks, to the battle. Brigade infantry, armed only with rifles, bazookas, and recoilless rifles, fought desperately but were outgunned and outnumbered. The collapse, April 18th to 19th. April 18th saw the brigade's position deteriorate rapidly. Castro's forces, now numbering over 20,000, attacked along all 3 causeways leading to the landing beaches. The brigade held initially, but ammunition was running critically low. The sunken supply ships had taken most of the brigade's reserves. San Roman sent increasingly desperate messages requesting air support, ammunition resupply, and evacuation of wounded. The CIA Operations Center at Quarters I in Washington received these messages, but could do nothing. Kennedy had made clear there would be no direct American intervention. At midnight on April 18th, Kennedy authorized 1 hour of air cover by Navy jets from the carrier Essex. The jets would protect a final ammunition supply run, but could not attack ground targets. Due to confusion over time zones, the jets arrived 1 hour before the B-20SXS they were supposed to protect. 4 brigade pilots in B-20SXS, flying without escort, were shot down. All 8 crew members died. By April 19th, the brigade's position was hopeless. They had been compressed into shrinking perimeters around the beaches. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Castro's tanks were breaking through defensive positions. Men were being killed and wounded faster than the brigade's few medics could treat them. At 2:32 p.m., San Roman sent his final message. AM destroying all equipment and communications. Tanks are in sight. I have nothing to fight with. AM taking to the swamp. Then silence. The aftermath. Over the next several days, Castro's forces systematically hunted down brigade survivors. Some men tried to hide in the swamp, but were captured by militia who knew the terrain. Others attempted to swim to sea, hoping for rescue by American ships that never came. A few managed to escape through the swamp and eventually made it back to the coast, where they were picked up weeks later. Final casualties: 114 brigade members killed in action. Approximately 1,189 captured. Castro paraded the prisoners before television cameras, humiliating them and by extension the United States. The prisoners would remain in Cuban jails for 20 months until ransomed for $53 million in food and medicine. American losses: 4 Alabama Air National Guard pilots flying CAP missions for the CIA were shot down and killed. Their deaths were covered up for years. Several CIA officers suffered career damage. Richard Bissell resigned. Allen Dulles retired. Political impact: Kennedy's administration was humiliated internationally. The Soviet Union used the invasion as propaganda evidence of American imperialism. Castro was strengthened domestically, able to position himself as a defender against Yankee aggression. Cuban-Soviet relations deepened, leading directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis 18 months later. The inquest: in the operation's aftermath, Kennedy established the Cuba Study Group to investigate what went wrong. The group, led by General Maxwell Taylor, interviewed over 50 witnesses and reviewed thousands of documents. Their report, delivered on June 13, 1961, was devastating. The fundamental problem was that the operation required success in multiple independent areas, any one of which could cause failure. It needed the initial air strike to destroy Castro's air force. It needed surprise landing. It needed popular uprising. It needed rapid establishment of a provisional government. It needed Castro's forces to collapse rather than fight. When the first airstrike failed to eliminate Castro's air force, the operation was doomed. Everything that followed was inevitable consequence. Brigade forces could not establish a defensible beachhead while being attacked from the air. They could not receive supplies with their ships sunk or fled. They could not hold out long enough for hope for uprising that was never going to occur. The CIA's planning was revealed as fundamentally flawed. The agency had developed expertise in covert operations against weak governments, but had no competence in conducting paramilitary operations against a determined enemy. The Guatemala model had succeeded because the target government chose not to fight. Castro chose to fight, and fight effectively. Military professionals who reviewed the plan afterward were unanimous. It could never have succeeded under the imposed constraints. Retired Marine Corps General Victor Krulak testified that a brigade-size amphibious landing against opposed beaches required naval gunfire support, air superiority, and substantially more force than 1,400 men. None of those requirements were met. The brigade's perspective: for the Cuban exiles of Brigade 2506, the Bay of Pigs was betrayal. They had been promised American air support that never materialized. They had been told Castro's forces would not fight. They had been assured the Cuban people would rise in support. Every promise proved false. Ernesto Oliva, captured at Playa Girón, later testified that the brigade could have succeeded with proper air support. We were winning until Castro's planes appeared. Once they sank our supply ships, we had no chance. The Americans promised U.S. air cover. They betrayed us. José San Roman, also captured, suffered depression and survivor's guilt for years. He had led men into battle based on American promises. When those promises proved empty, his men died or spent years in Cuban prisons. The psychological burden was immense. Interestingly, brigade members largely did not blame Kennedy personally. They blamed the CIA for misrepresenting the operation's viability and blamed Kennedy's advisors for poor counsel. Kennedy himself visited the brigade survivors after their release in December 1962, accepting personal responsibility for the failure. This gesture earned him respect from men who had every reason to hate him. Castro's victory: for Fidel Castro, the Bay of Pigs was a strategic triumph. He had defeated an American-backed invasion, proving his military competence and his revolution's strength. The victory allowed him to consolidate power further, eliminating remaining opposition by claiming all dissidents were potential CIA agents. The invasion also drove Cuba firmly into the Soviet camp. Before Bay of Pigs, Castro maintained some independence from Moscow. After, he had no choice but full alignment with the Soviets, who had warned him of the invasion and provided weapons to defeat it. Castro used captured brigade equipment for propaganda purposes. Tanks, weapons, and supplies were displayed in Havana's Revolution Square. Prisoners were paraded before cameras, forced to denounce American imperialism. The propaganda value was immense, both domestically and internationally. Years later, Castro would describe the Bay of Pigs as his greatest triumph. The United States sent its mercenaries to destroy the revolution. We destroyed them in 72 hours. This proved that a small nation, if determined and properly led, could defeat imperialism. The strategic consequences. The Bay of Pigs failure had profound strategic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military defeat. Kennedy, determined never to appear weak again after such public humiliation, adopted harder line positions in subsequent Cold War confrontations. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October 1962, Kennedy's handling was influenced by Bay of Pigs lessons. He insisted on direct presidential control of all decisions, not trusting military or intelligence advisors after their failure at the Bay of Pigs. This micromanagement arguably prevented nuclear war during the missile crisis's most dangerous moments. The failure also led to increased American covert operations against Castro. Operation Mongoose, authorized in November 1961, conducted hundreds of sabotage missions, assassination attempts, and propaganda operations. All failed to dislodge Castro, but they consumed resources and deepened Cuban-Soviet relations. In Vietnam, Kennedy's advisors would cite Bay of Pigs as justification for deeper commitment. The lesson drawn was not to avoid military intervention, but to commit sufficient force to ensure success. This logic contributed to escalating American involvement in Southeast Asia. The CIA's reckoning. For the Central Intelligence Agency, the Bay of Pigs was existential crisis. The operation exposed fundamental problems in the agency's culture, competence, and accountability. An organization designed for intelligence gathering had evolved into a paramilitary force, conducting operations it lacked expertise to execute. Kennedy's fury at the CIA was intense. He reportedly told aides he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. While he didn't dismantle the agency, he did restructure it fundamentally. The Directorate of Plans lost its autonomy. Future covert operations required more rigorous approval processes. The CIA's paramilitary capabilities were eventually transferred to the Department of Defense. Richard Bissell, the operations architect, resigned in February 1962. Allen Dulles, CIA director since 1953, retired in November 1961. Their departures marked the end of the CIA's golden age of covert operations, when the agency operated with minimal oversight and supreme confidence in its capabilities. The cultural impact within the CIA was profound. Officers who had believed in the agency's infallibility now questioned everything. The Guatemala model, which had guided covert operations for years, was recognized as successful accident rather than replicable formula. The agency became more cautious, more bureaucratic, less willing to take risks. The prisoner's ordeal. The 1,189 captured brigade members faced harsh imprisonment in Cuba. Castro initially threatened to execute them as mercenaries, but decided imprisonment was more valuable politically. The prisoners were held in multiple facilities, including the infamous Castillo del Príncipe fortress. Conditions were deliberately harsh. Prisoners were kept in overcrowded cells, with minimal food and no medical care. Several died from wounds sustained during the battle. Others succumbed to disease. Castro used the prisoners as bargaining chips, demanding $62 million in ransom. The Kennedy administration, while publicly stating it would not negotiate for hostages, worked behind the scenes to secure their release. Attorney General Robert Kennedy led negotiations personally, working with Cuban exile organizations and American companies to assemble the ransom package. The final agreement, reached in December 1962, traded the prisoners for $53 million in food and medicine. The prisoners returned to the United States on December 23, 1962, in time for Christmas. Their arrival at Homestead Air Force Base was an emotional reunion between survivors and families who had feared they would never return. Kennedy invited the brigade survivors to the Orange Bowl on December 29, 1962. In front of 40,000 people, Brigade 2506 presented Kennedy with their flag. Kennedy, moved by the ceremony, made a promise that would haunt him. "I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana." The military analysis. Military professionals analyzing the Bay of Pigs operation have consistently concluded it was doomed from conception. The fundamental problem was mismatch between objectives and means. The goal, overthrowing Castro's government, required conventional military capabilities. The means provided, 1,400 lightly armed infantry, were grossly inadequate. Amphibious operations are among the most complex military undertakings, requiring naval gunfire support, air superiority, armored vehicles, artillery, and overwhelming force at the point of landing. The Normandy invasion employed 156,000 troops in the first wave. The Incheon landing used 75,000 troops. Brigade 2506 had 1,400. The Bay of Pigs geography made the operation even more difficult. The landing beaches were small, restricting how quickly forces could come ashore. The surrounding swamp meant no room for maneuver. The three causeways were natural choke points where small defending forces could hold up much larger attacking forces. Castro's decision to commit his armored reserve immediately was tactically sound. T-34 and Stalin tanks against infantry, with only bazookas and recoilless rifles, was massacre waiting to happen. Brigade anti-tank weapons could disable tanks with lucky hits, but they couldn't stop a coordinated armor assault. The absence of American air support was fatal. Modern military doctrine recognizes that ground forces cannot operate effectively without air superiority. The brigade attempted exactly that, and the result was predictable. Castro's aircraft sank their supply ships, attacked their positions with impunity, and provided reconnaissance that allowed Cuban forces to concentrate precisely where needed. The intelligence community's lessons. The Bay of Pigs became case study in intelligence failure at multiple levels. First was collection failure. The CIA didn't accurately assess Castro's military capabilities or political support. Second was analysis failure. Available information was interpreted to support preferred conclusions rather than objectively. Third was politicization. Intelligence was shaped to tell policymakers what they wanted to hear. The assumption that Castro's forces would not fight was based on projection rather than evidence. CIA planners assumed Cuban soldiers would behave like Guatemalan soldiers in 1954. But Castro's army was motivated, trained, and loyal in ways Arbenz forces had not been. The CIA failed to recognize the difference. The expectation of popular uprising was pure wishful thinking. While many Cubans opposed Castro, few were willing to risk their lives based on a small invasion force. The brigade brought no political leadership that could credibly claim to represent Cuban aspirations. They were unknown exiles backed by foreigners. Post-Bay of Pigs, the intelligence community implemented reforms designed to prevent similar failures. Intelligence estimates were separated from operational planning. Analysis was subjected to competitive review. Covert operations required interagency coordination. Whether these reforms were effective is debatable. Similar intelligence failures occurred in Vietnam, Iraq, and elsewhere, but Bay of Pigs at least forced recognition that the system was broken. Kennedy's growth. Historians generally agree that the Bay of Pigs failure was crucial to Kennedy's development as president. The young, inexperienced president had deferred to supposed experts, the CIA, the Joint Chiefs, and been catastrophically wrong. He learned to trust his own judgment and question authority. This growth was evident during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When military advisors recommended immediate air strikes against Soviet missile sites in Cuba, Kennedy demanded alternatives. When the Joint Chiefs pushed for invasion, Kennedy insisted on blockade. His skepticism of military advice, born from Bay of Pigs experience, arguably prevented nuclear war. Kennedy also learned about the limits of American power. The United States couldn't simply impose its will on small neighbors through covert operations. Military force, even when successful, created political problems that undermined strategic objectives. These lessons influenced his approach to Vietnam, though not sufficiently to prevent American escalation after his death. The Bay of Pigs also taught Kennedy about loyalty and responsibility. Despite pressure to blame the CIA or Cuban exiles, he publicly accepted full responsibility. His statement, "Victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan," became famous. This acceptance of responsibility, though politically costly in the short term, earned him respect that served him well in subsequent crises. The Cuban exile community. For Cuban exiles in Miami and elsewhere, the Bay of Pigs was trauma that shaped community identity for generations. The brigade members who survived became heroes, symbols of willingness to fight for Cuba's liberation. Annual commemorations kept the memory alive. But Bay of Pigs also created bitter divisions. Some exiles blamed Kennedy for betraying the brigade. Others blamed the CIA for incompetent planning. Still others blamed brigade leadership for accepting an impossible mission. These recriminations poisoned exile politics for years. The failure also ended hope for quick return to Cuba. Before Bay of Pigs, many exiles believed Castro's regime would soon fall, allowing them to reclaim their properties and lives. After, they recognized they might never return. This realization forced psychological adjustment from temporary refugees to permanent immigrants. Brigade 2506 veterans struggled with survivor's guilt, PTSD, and the burden of failed expectations. They had promised to liberate Cuba and failed. Some never recovered psychologically. Others channeled their energy into anti-Castro activism that continued for decades. A few eventually reconciled with the failure and built new lives. The historical verdict. Historians analyzing the Bay of Pigs have reached near unanimous verdict. It was disaster born from hubris, poor planning, and wishful thinking. The operation violated basic military principles, ignored intelligence that contradicted preferred narratives, and proceeded despite warning signs that should have caused cancellation. The tragedy was that the failure was predictable. Multiple people involved, military officers, CIA analysts, even some Cuban exile leaders, recognized the plan was flawed but didn't stop it. Bureaucratic momentum, political pressure, and sunk cost fallacy combined to push forward an operation that rational analysis would have canceled. The Bay of Pigs also demonstrated the danger of covert operations conducted without adequate oversight. The CIA had operated with near-complete autonomy during the Eisenhower years. This autonomy allowed the Guatemala success, but also enabled the Bay of Pigs disaster. The lesson was clear. Covert operations require the same rigorous planning and oversight as conventional military operations. Most fundamentally, Bay of Pigs showed that good intentions and superior resources don't guarantee success. The United States had greater military power, better technology, and more resources than Cuba, but it lacked understanding of the operational environment, accurate intelligence, and realistic planning. Against a determined enemy fighting on home territory with everything to lose, these advantages proved insufficient. The final reckoning. On April 17, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles went ashore at the Bay of Pigs, believing they were liberating their homeland with American support. By April 19th, their brigade had ceased to exist as fighting force. 114 were dead. 1,189 were prisoners. Their mission had failed completely. The causes of failure were multiple and interconnected. Flawed intelligence underestimated Castro's military capabilities and overestimated popular opposition. Political constraints eliminated the air support that might have made the operation viable. Military planning was amateur, conducted by intelligence officers lacking combat experience. Kennedy's inexperience prevented him from recognizing the operation was doomed before it began. But perhaps the deepest failure was psychological. The CIA, Kennedy's advisors, and the Cuban exiles themselves wanted so desperately to believe the operation would succeed that they ignored evidence to the contrary. They laughed at concerns, dismissed skeptics, and convinced themselves that determination would overcome practical obstacles. The Cuban exiles had laughed at Kennedy's constraints, confident that American power would ensure victory regardless of limitations. Kennedy's advisors had laughed at warnings the operation was too small, too poorly planned, too dependent on wishful assumptions. The CIA had laughed at suggestions Castro's forces would fight effectively. The Bay of Pigs didn't laugh back. It simply killed and captured men who deserved better than to die for a plan that was doomed from inception. The massacre wasn't caused by enemy superiority, but by friendly incompetence. That made the failure even more bitter. Jose San Roman, interviewed years later, summed up the tragedy with painful simplicity. We were good men sent on an impossible mission by people who didn't understand what they were asking. We fought well. We died well. But we never had a chance. That's the truth of the Bay of Pigs. Brave men betrayed by bad planning and false promises. The Brigade 2506 flag that Kennedy received at the Orange Bowl never returned to free Havana. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Castro ruled Cuba until 2008, outlasting 10 American presidents. The Bay of Pigs became a historical footnote, a Cold War embarrassment, a case study in how not to conduct covert operations. But for the men who fought there, for the families of those who died, for the prisoners who spent 20 months in Cuban jails, it was something more personal and painful. It was the moment when confidence met reality, when laughter turned to screams, when promise became betrayal. The Bay of Pigs had promised liberation. It delivered only defeat, death, and the bitter lesson that in war, optimism is not strategy, hope is not planning, and laughter is often the prelude to tears.